The Problem with Lincoln by Thomas J. DiLorenzo. I'm going to read some of the quotes on the back of the book. Tom has spent much of his career smashing the cult-like veneration of the American presidency that has been instilled in the American public, and this important and necessary work on the most venerated of all is a must for the independent thinker. Quote by Tom Woods, best-selling author and senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. The Lincoln myth has been baneful for Republican self-government in America as it is fashionable. Any doubt about this will be challenged by reading this continually stimulating and revolutionary study of the man most academic historians rank as America's greatest president. Donald W. Livingston, retired professor of philosophy, Emory University, and president of the Abbeville Institute. The Sacred Father, Abraham, was the central figure in the destruction of the Founding Fathers' constitutional republic and its conversion by bloody means into the unlimited government of crony capitalism and worldwide empire that we suffer under today. No scholar has been as perceptive and courageous as Professor Thomas DiLorenzo in bringing enlightenment about the real Lincoln to the public. Clyde Wilson, Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus, University of South Carolina. Millions of America genuflect to Saint Abraham at his Parthenon in Washington, D.C. each year. If they read this book, they would bring sledgehammers. Brian McClanahan, author of How Alexander Hamilton Screwed Up America and 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America. So I'm going to show you what Lincoln did and how he did it. So we go to the Constitution and I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can. The original writing of the Constitution, signed by the Founding Fathers or the Federalists or deputies, as they're called, their idea of the Constitution, of a constitutional federal government, was to place the military under the seat of government in Washington, D.C., and that the military would equally protect all the states, and they would do it on the lands that the federal government purchased with consent of the states. The states at the time were free, sovereign, and independent, and were the creators of the federal government, and the federal government was creators of the federal military. Now you fast forward to Lincoln, and what Lincoln did was he took over all the sovereign areas, expanded the federal government, and took over the legislatures of the people. So originally, the federal government was given lands inside each of the states to do their federal works, which was defense of freedom, liberty, prosperity, and happiness. That's what they were supposed to achieve. They were supposed to achieve that by building a strong military on those particular lands that they were given consent to purchase. And the laws were supposed to be made by the federal government on those lands without state interference. So a sovereign state that joins the Union, as part of its ratification process, was to sell some small lands to the federal government And those lands, they were also to cede jurisdiction, which is lawmaking authority. So the federal government gave up the lands and the right to make the laws for those lands to the federal government, but only for defense purposes, defense with a C. And that's what the federal government, is supposed to control, according to the original Constitution. Now, after Lincoln brought on the Civil War with his amendment to slavery, he expanded the idea of what the first deputies who signed the Constitution wanted. Those founding fathers had certain ideas that the federal government would protect freedom, liberty, sovereignty, and independence of the people by doing the works within the Constitution on the federal lands. And they would use military force against any enemy that tried to take that away from us, the sovereign people and the sovereign states. What Lincoln did was to expand the federal government off the federal lands and take over the sovereign people and the sovereign state governments, as well as their sovereign land. He did this by using his imagination to assert that the government that the sovereign people made for themselves, which was their state governments, were illegal, and that they had no right to leave the Union. So he took and used the military to take over the sovereign areas, the sovereign people, and their sovereign governments. This one act has been the usurpation of power, the tyranny brought on by the federal government over all the people, the overtaking of our school system, the expansion of corporations, and the power that they have over people, the power the federal government has over those corporations, including banking, forcing people to sign contracts that they don't want to sign, forcing people to get licenses that they don't want, forcing people into a legal system that they don't want to be a part of, forcing people to use a monetary system that they don't want to be a part of, and overtaking the right of the people to move freely, to import and export their own goods by expanding commerce off the federal lands, by expanding federal taxes off the federal lands, by expanding all those things in the Constitution to be over all the states, all the time, everywhere. So let's go back to the beginning. It wasn't meant to be that way. The founding fathers didn't mean it to be that way. That's not what the Constitution says. That's not what the Constitution allows. That is completely outside the Constitution. The Constitution was to only allow the federal government to make laws over the federal lands, and they acquired those federal lands through purchasing of them with the consent of the sovereign people and the sovereign state and their sovereign governments that they created for themselves. But he used slavery and the Civil War to his advantage to get what he wanted, which was to make the federal government the government. And it is not. So we're going to look at a couple things. The first thing is that in the Congressional Globe in 1867, on page 1565, Mr. Cowan says this: Mr. President, I do not rise for the purpose of discussing the relative merits of the several propositions which have been before the other House and this body, nor do I rise for the purpose of discussing the best mode by which to attain immediate action, but it is for another purpose. The Honorable Senator from Illinois, Mr. Trumbull, has stated here publicly in debate that the Freedmen's Bureau bill has not been executed, and that the fault lies with the President and the Senator from Massachusetts, Mr. Sumner, rises and endorses that statement, as of course he might be expected to do. Now, I will read the preamble of the bill we passed day before yesterday morning, which the Senator from Massachusetts thinks expresses a great truth. The preamble says, quote, "No legal state governments," end quote, "exist in the South." Why, Mr. President, what is a legal state government? Is it a government cooked up for a state here in Congress? Or is it a government that the people of the state make for themselves? I like a plain answer to a plain question. Who made these state governments? The state government of Louisiana was made by the people of Louisiana under a proclamation issued by Mr. Lincoln, referring that question to them. The question then arose between Mr. Lincoln and the senator from Massachusetts and others of his school as to whom this question should be referred to as people, or in other words, who are the people? Radical gentlemen said the people are all persons, black and whites altogether. Mr. Lincoln, however, on consulting the lawyers, was informed that the word people had two significations, that in its general and ordinary signification it did mean everybody, whites and blacks, but that in its technical or political meaning it meant the people of a state who were entrusted with the political power of the state. And by what law? The law of the state. There is no other law fixing who this technical class of persons are anywhere existing. Not even the ingenuity of those who invent so many things has ever, so far as I know, discovered any law anywhere except upon the statute books of a state to discover who the people were to whom this question should be referred. And he goes on. So he's asking, what is a legal state government? Is a legal state government something that is made up in Congress? Do the men in Congress just make up what a state is? Or is a legal state government a government made by the people of the state? Now, originally, the states were made up of the people of the state, the inhabitants of the state. Not by Congress. And once the people made the state and they made up a government for themselves, they were in charge of their government. And that became a legal state, or a lawful state, you could say, a natural state. And that's the way it was when a state ratified the Constitution. It was a state created by the people of that area, of that land. When the state joined the Union, they joined by selling some lands to the federal government, and along with those lands, allowing the federal government to be the sole source of the law, specifically only for those lands that they sold. That's the exclusive jurisdiction spoken of in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. For defense purposes, okay, all the buildings that are listed are for defense purposes. Defense with a C is how the Constitution spells it, which means fortifications. Defense with an S is a Latin word, which means vengeance. So the federal government was simply supposed to fortify the states with federal military posts, and then they were supposed to run the military on those posts. What Lincoln did was he moved the state to be the entire state and under federal control. And he did it by lying, by saying that the states had no legal state government. This is a bill, 40th Congress, First Session, S7, in the Senate of the United States, March 6, 1867. Mr. Sumner, this is Mr. Sumner that's being spoken of by Mr. Cowan in the Congressional Globe in 1867, 1565. Mr. Sumner asked, and by unanimous consent obtained, leave to bring the following bill, which was read twice and ordered to be printed. A bill to guarantee a Republican form of government in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, to provide for restoration of these states to practical relations with the Union. I'd like to point out to you here, before I read the rest of this, that Texas had a constitution drafted and signed in 1836, forming a legal state government for itself by the inhabitants in a Republican form. So this state is what ratified the Constitution, allowing the federal government to come into the Republic of Texas and onto the federal lands to build forts and then to regulate the people on those federal lands. So Texas had a legal state government before it joined the Union, and when it left the Union, had a legal state government. It had to have a legal state government in order to make the move to leave the Union. But Lincoln says no. It wasn't a legal state government. It was an illegal state government. And then so Lincoln moved the military in and took over it, took over the Republic of Texas and made it State of Texas. State of Texas were just the federal areas inside Republic of Texas that Republic of Texas agreed to allow the federal government to make. That's in the contract. And that's the way the contract was written. And those are in the first congressional acts before Lincoln, way before Lincoln, before Texas was a state. Virginia allowed some western lands to be sold to the United States so that the United States could add those areas to its federal state called State of Virginia. So Virginia sold lands to the United States so that the United States could have a state within Virginia, and the federal state inside Virginia was State of Virginia, which were the federal lands where the federal government makes laws. It makes laws for its own state. So let's read the rest of this. And I only have the first page for some reason. I didn't get the whole thing. Whereas in the years 1860 and 1861, the inhabitants of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas changed their respective constitutions so as to make them repugnant to the Constitution of the United States, And whereas the inhabitants of these states made war upon the United States and after many battles finally surrendered under the rules and usages of war. Usages. Okay, that's an important word because usages is detention and possession, legally or illegally, by means of force. Okay. And whereas the inhabitants of these states at the time of their surrender were without legal state governments and as a rebel population were without authority to form legal state governments or to exercise any other political functions belonging to loyal citizens, and they must so continue until relieved of such disabilities by the lawmaking power of the United States. And it continues. And so, what I want to point out here also is that the sovereign states joined the Union. The sovereign states were supposed to control the Union. And so, when the sovereign states left the Union, the sovereign states did not have to ask to leave. It's the United States that has to ask to leave the sovereign states. Because the states, the sovereign states, created the federal government, and what you create you control, and also what you create you can end. The United States did not create the sovereign states. The United States cannot overtake the sovereign states legally, and they can't expand their jurisdiction, and they can't leave the states, the sovereign states. It cannot form its own government. That's in the laws also. It cannot become an independent state because it was created by sovereign states. But Lincoln turned it around and he said, the states tried to leave, so we went in and told them they couldn't because of the Constitution. But that's not the meaning of the Constitution. The meaning of the Constitution is the United States works for the sovereign states because it says the people of the United States, in the preamble, the people of the United States do all these things for the United States of America, the sovereign states. So the United States is an agency or agents that does things, promote prosperity, freedom, liberty, general welfare for all the states. They work for the states, the sovereign states. Okay? Now, there's a lot in politics of people saying things that aren't true to get what they want. Or they turn things around and they say, well, you don't have a right to do that, when actually it's them that doesn't have a right to do it. So I'm going to read you this last quote again on the back of the book, The Problem with Lincoln by Thomas J. DiLorenzo. And that's, he says, Brian McClanahan says, millions of Americans genuflect to St. Abraham at his Parthenon in Washington, D.C. each year. If they read this book, they will bring sledgehammers. Okay, because all of our problems that we have now, where the federal government has taken control of our sovereign lands and forced their laws on us, as sovereign people, and forced us into contracts and forced us into licenses and forced us into paying taxes and forced us to have our commerce regulated and forced us to have our natural resources taken over by the federal government. They did it all illegally, and it was because of Lincoln. Because Lincoln said the states were acting illegally when they tried to leave the Union, when really it's the Union that can't leave the states. The states have to end the Union. The Union cannot end the states. But that's what Lincoln did. He made all the sovereign states dependent states illegally. What that means is it's as if it never happened, because any act outside of the Constitution is void, not voidable. You don't have to go to court and have it voided. So it's not voidable, it's just void, like it never existed. You don't have to go to a court and prove that something isn't that never was. Okay, so I hope that you understand everything I've said here. If you don't, you can post questions and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Please like, share, subscribe. I do this for freedom, for liberty, for the future, for our children, and for restoring the correct perspective of what the Constitution is and what the Constitution is not. So have a great day, and I'll see you back here hopefully soon.